And welcome. Welcome to this part 2 of an installment series on human capital disclosure and metrics. And we are in a new era of disclosure. And so it's our pleasure to welcome you to this conference board webcast today. We have some terrific panelists that we'll be introducing in just a few moments. But for those of you I've not had the pleasure of joining us in a webcast, I'm Rebecca Ray, and I'll be taking you through this process today. And I will introduce my co-moderator and our wonderful panelists in just a moment. But first, I have the pleasure of doing the housekeeping things, which is always exciting. And Paul Washington, who is my co-moderator today, leads the ESG Center here at the conference board. I lead the Human Capital one, and we've partnered on some brand new research, and that's partly what we will use to inform our thoughts today as we begin to tap the wisdom of our terrific guests. So a couple of housekeeping things. There are continuing ed credits that are available. The instructions are here as you see them. I would suggest that you let us know in the chat pod where it says requesting the credits that you'd like them. If you put them there as opposed to the regular chat box, which is in the lower left-hand corner, you stand a good chance of us actually seeing it and responding it. I also would just mention to you that as we've all learned from the Zoom challenge that we've had or video conferences we've had all this year, if you haven't learned already, that your audio and video quality will be greatly enhanced if you turn off other open apps. I would also suggest to you that this is the kinds of things that we thought might be of most interest. And again, there is a part 1 that was done last month, and that's available on demand. And today we're going to spend some time talking about the SEC disclosure rules, and particularly the kinds of things that that boards and investors should be thinking about as we go down this new and brave world. We want to talk a little bit about what companies should be doing to prepare their boards and what kinds of things will constitute materiality and what kinds of disclosure metrics will be at the forefront. And we want to know, have a discussion around what investors and companies can do to prepare for constructive and really engaging conversations around human capital, which we all know is coming to the forefront in terms of all of the ways in which it can shape a company's disclosure. So again, this is the report that will be out shortly, and it is part of a long-standing working group, and we had some wonderful folks representing many of the different constituencies and talking about human capital management and disclosure and what will be different. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Paul if you might introduce our terrific guests.
Sure. Thanks so much, Rebecca, and welcome to everyone. Well, so we've got 2 people signed up for this, and one of whom we have not yet got a good connection with. So we currently have Aisha Masani from CalSTRS. Aisha is the portfolio manager for sustainable investments and stewardship strategies. So welcome, Aisha. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. And our other panelist, who is currently in process of trying to establish a good audio connection, is Bill O'Shaughnessy, who's Deputy General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Quest Diagnostics. This year, it's been at the center of so much of what's been happening with the pandemic. So hopefully we'll get Bill online, but until then, it'll be the 3 of us holding the fort together. So let me tee this up, if I might, by talking a little bit about the new SEC disclosure rules, if that's okay, Rebecca. I think most people watching this webcast are familiar with them, but some people may not be. So just so we're all on the same page, I think, as most people do know, in August 2020, the SEC adopted new rules that require companies to disclose in the business description of their 10K, their annual report on the Form 10K, 2 things. The company's human capital resources, including its number of employees, and second, any human capital measures or objectives that the company uses the focus in managing its business. And it needs to make these disclosures to the extent that the disclosure of these is necessary to an understanding, is material to the understanding of the company's business overall. So those are the 2 areas, the human capital resources and your measures and objectives to the extent that they're material. So, you know, the SEC provided limited guidance, I think is a fair way to put it. They didn't define human capital. When it comes to describing human capital resources, they suggest you might want to talk about your number, in addition to the number of employees, your number of full-time employees, your temporary employees, your contractors, and so forth. When it comes to measures and objectives, they say, well, you may want to talk about the development, attraction, and retention of talent, of your workforce. Okay, so not a whole lot for companies to go on there, right? But that's what the SEC did here. So stepping back, there's both a narrow way of looking at these rules and then a broader one and maybe even a third one. So the narrow one is that this is really just tweaking a little bit of language of one section of your Form 10K. All the SEC did is it expanded on one of the 7 suggested topics that you should cover in the description of your business. Didn't change anything you put in your proxy, didn't change anything you put in your CSR report, didn't even change these other sections of your 10K that could relate to human capital. So that's a very narrow way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it that's broader is that this is sort of the thin edge of the wedge. This is the SEC getting into the business of having you put ESG, human capital disclosures, into your Form 10K. And both of those may be true, in fact, the narrow and the broad view. But I think in whatever view you subscribe to is that these rules are coincident with a new focus on human capital. It's been building for a while in the investment community, in the regulatory community, and really brought to the fore in the pandemic, where workforce issues have really leapt at the top of boards' agendas and investor agendas. So I think this is a moment, regardless of how you view the SEC rules, where companies are focusing on their disclosure and more broadly their communications when it relates to human capital. So that's a little bit of background for our discussion today. Back to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, Paul, I think that's right. I mean, it does give a company an opportunity to shape its narrative here if you look at it in a little bit broader sense. So I hope that clearly is the way that the folks begin to think about this. So just before we tap the wisdom here, and I may ask Paul that you provide your views as well as a corporate attorney, and weigh in on some of these things. So we'll just roll along here. But let's start with a couple of poll questions, and let's start with the first one. So we'll give you just a few moments to respond. But is your company planning to increase your disclosures on human capital in 2021? And you can see your answer is to varying degrees, either significantly or somewhat, or not sure by how much, or not at all, or unsure, or you haven't begun to think about this issue. So hopefully one of those responses will speak to you. Give you another few seconds. Okay, let's take a look at the results then. Great. So unsure, which hopefully this webcast today will help a little bit as we begin to sort of talk about some of your options. And there other responses were yes, but unclear as to just how much. Nobody said significantly yet. And I think that's because we're all sort of sifting through just what this means company by company. So Paul, do you want to go to the next slide, or should we ask another poll question?
Why don't we do the next poll question, and then we can, but this is really interesting, actually.
Okay, great. So then let's bring up the next one. It says, what do you think will be the main driver of the increase in human capital disclosures? So your choices are the new SEC rules, a change in the business, interest by employees, customers, the general public, investor interest. What's going to drive the increase in human capital disclosures? Give you another 30 seconds, or just a few seconds here. Okay, let's show the results here. We have largely investor focus on human capital, followed by the SEC rules themselves. Change in the business is kind of interesting. And to your point earlier, Paul, a lot of the business implications certainly, but also social justice issues and also the pandemic. And there's been a tremendous pivot to human capital related issues. So So there we are. So interest by employees, customers, the general public, less so. Well, Paul, what's your quick take on these two polls?
Thanks. I, this is actually a little bit consistent with what we heard in our in the working group, Rebecca, that you and I co-chaired, and that's going to result in this report. So overall, it's somewhat more cautious. I think the people who are engaged in our working group were a little more committed to increasing their disclosure, but that's not in some ways that surprising. It means that a lot of companies out there are really grappling with whether they're going to disclose anything more, and if so, how much. The thing that's quite consistent is that what's driving this is only in part the SEC rules. What we heard in the working group room, and what we're hearing now through this poll, and Aisha will get your perspective on it, is that actually investors are the #1 driver here of increased human capital disclosure. I mean, I think that's pretty powerful. And then I think the second thing is that it is a natural development coming out of the pandemic, regardless of the SEC rules, and even regardless even maybe of investor interest. The big driver here is just your company's story has changed because of the impact of the pandemic on the workforce. So I think those are a couple kind of broad takeaways from that.
I think that's right. And, we are in an age of transparency. And so I think this is just part of a larger groundswell. Aisha, what do you think when you look at the results of these two quick polls?
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. And the polls were actually quite interesting because I don't think it would surprise anyone that CalSTRS was somewhat disappointed in the rulemaking that came out of the SEC. We basically believe that, we know that over the last couple decades, most companies, the transition from what they would call, the tangible to the intangible assets has dramatically shifted. And part of that is due to this increase in human capital. And I think it's astonishing that up until this point, and even now it's somewhat limited, companies have only been required to disclose the number of employees. When we talk to companies, and at CalSTRS we talk to hundreds of companies every year, they all tell us that their most valuable asset is their human capital, and yet there's such limited disclosure around it. And so what we've been asking the SEC, and I think even though these recent rules came out, I also think that there's a transition happening, obviously, with the administration. We're going to continue to push at the regulators for more specific, universal metrics, and obviously doing panels like this where we have a lot of opportunity to engage with a wide group of issuers, to tell our story and what we're looking for. Because I think although the first poll question was somewhat disappointing in terms of what the SEC came out with, I was really heartened by the second, which is this increasing focus on what investors are looking for. And so just to quickly kind of give the basics of what CalSTRS thinks is important. Number one, yes, the number of employees employed by the issuer. But what we're really looking for is that broken down by full-time, part-time, and contingent workers. The second thing we're looking for, what's the total cost of an issuer's workforce, including wages, benefits, employee expenses? Thirdly, what's your turnover? We all know it's more expensive to hire employees rather than keep an engaged workforce. So we want to understand that turnover piece. And then last but not least, the workforce diversity data. And we really think that those 4 metrics taken together can help investors understand effective human capital management and identify human capital risks and opportunities. So, and we think that those 4 metrics are actually pretty reasonable and can be done, with minimal cost to most issuers.
I think that's right, and I think also the questions that are going to become as important also are going to be things around what's the culture of the company, because that drives engagement, that drives retention, that drives a variety of things. But it's a little more difficult to measure, not impossible, but it is a little bit more difficult to measure. I've got a question from one of our attendees today. wanting to know whether or not this new mandate can be viewed as a competitive advantage. A lot of times companies have used the opportunities to help shape their narrative around the culture and what it's like to work here and the kinds of values that they hold. Do you think that this additional disclosure will help some companies to stand out among their peers?
I absolutely agree, Rebecca. In fact, if anyone on the participating today would go and look at the CalSTRS corporate governance principles, when we talk about human capital management, we talk about it in the sense that we do think it can be a competitive advantage for issuers, and that's why we think it's so important to have disclosure metrics around that.
Paul, your thoughts. I know you spend a lot of time looking at some of the things that are being disclosed and how narratives get shaped, particularly from an ESG perspective. But certainly,
I would say that the SEC rules themselves, I think what can happen is the SEC rules will cause your board and senior management to focus on their human capital story in a way they haven't. It won't be your 10K disclosure that's going to give you the great information, because there's like 20 people in the world, half of them work at CalSTRS, actually, the ones that are actually reading your 10K, right? But it's what you tell more broadly, right? So the disclosure rules are going to trigger a look at what your human capital story is. And then it definitely can be a competitive advantage, not just with attracting employees, right, but with other business partners who want to work with you because of how you treat your workers, with your consumers, right, with a whole array of other people that, with research is coming out all the time about how all these other stakeholders care about how you treat your workers, right? And so I think what's happening here is, with all of the ESG disclosure and human capital in particular, what it needs to be looked at is not just as a compliance obligation, but as a competitive opportunity to get your story out there. And workers are at the center of it.
Yep. We've got a question here, and it relates to something I was planning to ask, and that's how companies begin to think about what to disclose. How do they determine what's material, and how will they go about selecting those things? So they have to figure out what they're going to disclose in terms of human capital resources, and then also the human capital objectives and measures you focus on. And the specific question that's coming up now in the chat is around diversity metrics. So I wondered if maybe, Paul, could I ask you to start us off about how companies are sort of framing the way they think about this?
Look, I think that what companies are doing is that they're running human capital through their usual process of materiality assessment, which frankly involves a fair amount of judgment. There isn't any universal test. There's not a blood test you can take out there, or some test that says, okay, this fact is going to change it's going to significantly alter the mix of information that an investor would use to decide what to disclose. There isn't a magic test. So you have to use your judgment. But it should be an informed judgment. So a very important part of this is to listen to your investors, have conversations with them, and figure out what is in fact important to your investors when it comes to the human capital aspect of your business. It's also talking to people throughout your company, your senior business leaders as well as your business unit heads. Because the SEC wants you to look at human capital that's important to a particular part of your business. Find out what really matters to them in running the business. And then, of course, you look at your peers and what other people have been disclosing in this area and their reporting frameworks and so forth. But I think really listen to your investors, listen to your management, and then going through the usual process you go through to say, okay, is this important? I would frankly err on the side a little bit of disclosing more rather than less in this area, even as you're doing the materiality assessment, because if you're not going to put it in the 10K because it doesn't rise to the level of materiality, you're going to put it somewhere else. And there's not that much harm that comes from putting it in your 10K as well. So I would take a somewhat, not overly generous, but somewhat generous view of what's material when it comes to human capital, sort of making up for what Aisha talked about, which has been a deficit in human capital disclosure in the 10K for years. There's been this profound disconnect, right, People are our most important asset. And by the way, all we're telling you is the number of employees. So I think that's the process, to exercise informed judgment here.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Aisha, from your view, what's your take?
See there's a couple of questions popping up in the chat that are really focused on, what are we looking for in terms of diversity? And I think this is just, it's been pushed to the forefront given, various social unrest, that's happening around the country. But, what we're really looking for, and we used to have a focus just on boards in particular because we think that illustrates a tone from the top, but now we are looking further into the workforce itself because we want to create that pipeline. And so we're looking for gender, ethnic, and racial diversity across different employment bands and employee levels. So we really do want to understand what the composition looks like at different levels of the organization. Now, I'm not a human resource lawyer. I'm an investor by trade, so I can't answer all the questions around the legal aspects of this. But when we talk to companies, we do understand that this has to be, a self-disclosure. I don't think that anyone can, from the outside. I mean, even us as investors, when we look at directors' pictures in the proxy, I can't make an assessment of what a particular person identifies with when it comes to, racial and ethnic diversity, just given the melting pot that, America is. And so I think it's around self-disclosure and, getting comfortable and but making that information available to investors.
There's an interesting question here that's very related, and Paul talks a little bit about, how much disclosure begins to be a liability or a risk. I know you just said that you would prefer to, err a little bit on the side of disclosing more versus less, but some of the data is very sensitive, and I wonder what your thoughts are, the kinds of things you're hearing.
Sure. What I'm hearing from a lot of general counsels of major, it's actually general counsel. It's a weird term, right? So more than the top lawyers at a lot of companies is actually that for a while they were told we can't disclose EEO-1 data, it's a big risk, it's the last thing you want to do. They're disclosing it now without a significant change in what they believe their risk profile is. So, I mean, each company has to make this decision on its own, and some of the companies are doing this are already facing so many other risks out there that this doesn't dramatically change the landscape. But people, I think, are just getting more comfortable with, that EEO-1 data are something that they can be comfortable disclosing. I would say, though, that there are shortcomings to that data. I mean, Rebecca, you're deeply familiar with it. And so I think it's helpful for companies to say, all right, that may be part of what we disclose, but really what, when it comes to diversity, matters to us, to our business. We're a global company. So how does diversity work for us when we're talking about diversity across a global workforce? The various reporting frameworks out there don't actually do a consistent job of telling companies what they should disclose when it comes to diversity. So I think you look at those frameworks and then you figure out what really matters too. But specifically with EEO-1 data, companies are becoming increasingly comfortable disclosing it.
Yeah, you've got, I think, a cultural shift in America to disclose more, to be more transparent, and a lot of people overshare. We don't need to go there now on this public webcast, but it's a cultural thing that we have now going on with the oversharing. Here's the thing. I don't want to lose sight of a company's duty to kind of really tell its story, right? And so I'd love your thoughts from both of you. How do you tell that fuller human capital story so that yes, it is about what you choose to disclose, but it's also about how you put together that narrative. So what are the ways in which you think companies do a great job in telling that human capital story?
Yeah, please go ahead if you.
No, I think this is a great question, Rebecca, because we talked about this a little bit on our prep call, not to give any secrets away, but I think issuers.
All about transparency.
There's so many obviously required disclosures, from the 10Ks that Paul talked about and to the proxy information to sustainability reports. And I think that it's important to recognize that you do have different audiences for all of those documents. And while, Paul, I appreciate that you said that the CalSTRS probably reads those 10Ks, the 10K is probably the last thing we read. I think we're really focused on the proxy, because I think the proxy does, it's a disclosure piece, but it's also a communication tool to your investors. And I think that's probably one of the best places to kind of tell your story, because it not only, it's interlinked to the company strategy, to who you have sitting on your board, to how you set up your compensation strategy. These are all things that tell us as investors about the culture of your organization. And I think that document is a great place to start, because there's also an action item associated with it when it comes to, voting for directors, proposals, and compensation.
I think that's right. I think if you think about sort of three principal documents that companies, and your disclosure and communication doesn't need to be document-based, but let's start with the documents, right? And that's something we talked about with Bill. If you were here, he'd share this as well, which is what goes into your 10K kind of provides you with an overall framework for, okay, here are the key, here's how we're describing our workforce, here are the key things we're focusing on when it comes to our workforce. But obviously, it's a 10K, you've got a lot of other things in there. It's not going to be an arena for your full disclosure. Proxy, as you said, is very important in reaching that key audience of your investors. And if you're telling your story there, it's the story that you want to tell your investors, and especially your board's involvement in human capital management. What is your board doing? Boards have multiple levers regarding human capital, whether it's promotion, succession planning, oversight of diversity, compensation. How are all those levers that the board's pulling working in the direction of fulfilling your overall capital management strategy? So that's a really good place to put that story in your proxy statement. But then you also want to have communications that reach your employees, that reach the general public, that reach a broader audience, and it may be in your CSR report, it may be on your website, which, or some other disclosures, and it should be, your communications in that area need to be more broader, accessible, and always available, because, a lot of investors, if they still get it by paper, and a lot of people, when they toss your proxy statement out. I mean, I was meeting with a senior SEC staffer who said, this is interesting, whenever I get your proxy statement, I just put it in the trash. This is a senior SEC person, right? So people need a place to go to get your human capital story when they're interested in it, not on an annual cycle. So it's got to be an ever-present, ever-refreshed story out there.
And I'll just add one other thing, too, because I think that even among your, company's investors, the 10K, I would probably argue or suspect that, that's a different type of investor. A lot of times that's the analyst, that's the sell side.
Right.
Whereas, the buy side, like CalSTRS, that's, we get most of our information from the proxy. We're not looking for, because we're such long-term investors, we'd rather understand the narrative and the story than exactly, earnings from quarter to quarter.
Right. I think that's right. It's a longer-term story that you're trying to get at.
We've touched earlier on, and Ayesha, you were kind of talking about the different areas that you look for from a human capital perspective and the various things that you look at. Do you think that the SEC ruling is going to shift that at all? Do you think there's anything additional that's going to rise to the top in terms of what companies should begin to think about disclosing?
I think it's hard to say. I think the SEC currently obviously was in a little bit of a flux, and with the new administration and depending on who lands in those seats, I think we could see a different sort of culture at the SEC, so to speak. And for STRS, we're going to keep trying to push on all these angles, because we think like we said, we think it provides us, a way to evaluate risks and also opportunities. And so, we do that on the regulatory front. We do that with, engaging directly with our portfolio companies, and we do it in forums like this where we can reach, a broad group of issuers to try to communicate our story and what we're looking for.
So when companies talk about how difficult it may be to either capture or disclose some of these human capital related metrics or issues, what do they cite as the primary barriers? Who's doing a good job of overcoming some of them?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because, we've talked to a lot of companies about those four, basic metrics that we're looking for. At CERS, we're also undertaking a new initiative we're calling the Pandemic Resilient 50. And basically, this is 50 companies, and it's a whole group of global investors that have agreed to participate. And we identified 50 companies that had been, greatly affected by the pandemic, either from reputational risk, maybe it was a lack of disclosures, a reduced demand for their goods and services because of the industry that they're in. And so we identify these 50 companies, and now what we're doing is we're really going on a fact-finding mission, to understand how these companies are, managing their human. It's all related to human capital, but it's basically, also business continuity. It's also about financial alignment. Some of these companies did receive, stimulus or bailout. We want to understand that source of funding is really used to ensure the long-term sustainability of these companies. We want to understand simple things like if there are temporary measures that they put in place, for example, paid sick leave, is that something that they think they'll continue once the pandemic has receded? Did they find that helped with a more engaged workforce? Because there are some studies that talk about, engaged workforces, lowering turnover. These things really do become a competitive advantage for companies. And I think that trying to understand, unfortunately, the pandemic sort of shoves human capital in the spotlight. We've always known it was important, but, we want to make sure that focus on appropriately managing human capital doesn't go away just because the virus does.
And Rebecca, I was just going to say on we have seen companies who have done quite a good job in disclosures on human capital in a variety of places, whether it's Prudential or Lockheed Martin. There are a number of companies that have done it, particularly, as you mentioned, Aisha, in their proxy statements, that have really done a nice comprehensive job. So it is possible. I think, and Rebecca, you'll be familiar with this very much from your prior and your current roles, like there's an issue in just the reliability of the data. Some of the data are coming from a wide variety of different systems spread out across the globe. We saw this when we went through the CEO pay ratio. Like, boy, was that a lot harder than a lot of people who wrote the rules ever imagined to come up with the reliability of the data. So I think that is a barrier, but I think companies, we've talked to the people who run those data systems and provide the software, companies should be able to have the information that they need within some reasonable amount of time to have the data they need. The real barrier, though, I think, for companies having effective disclosure in this area is, frankly, the time and attention necessary at the board and senior management level to do a real thoughtful assessment of what is the workforce you've got now and what is the workforce you need in the future to achieve your business objectives. It's that assessment of capabilities and culture that you need to take the time at a board meeting and with your senior management to think through. And then you also have to think through, okay, what's the board's role in helping to make sure that actually happens, that transition from the workforce you have to the workforce you need. if you don't take the time and attention to do that, you're not going to be able to tell a complete human capital management story, certainly to your investors. You need other components for the other constituencies, like your customers and employees and so forth. But for telling your story to investors, it's really a question to a large extent. Some of it's reliability of data, but it's the time at your board meetings and time with your senior management to do that assessment of where you are, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there, which a lot of companies just, with everything else they've been doing, just have not done.
No question. And you know, all of this has to align, because the same story that you want to tell has to be consistent, because you've got prospective employees who are making choices about what you stand for and what your culture is like and what your people are like, and they'll decide, you know, this scarce talent that you want to attract, they'll decide where they want to go. And so I think there's an awful lot of reasons why this needs to be a thoughtful process, which I think brings us to the question is, you know, how do you prepare boards for this increased level of disclosure and scrutiny? So what's the ways in which we need to start that?
Yeah,
and Paul, can I ask you to maybe start
which will be part of the toolkit that comes out with the new report if that pops up. Okay, so some of the things you need to do, which I alluded to a bit before. First, figure out what you mean by human capital. Make sure, I think the key thing here is it's not just your employees, it's your workforce writ large, right? You have to figure out what are the areas of human capital that are really important to your business, and identify those within your management team. And then you have to engage your board on this. So you've got to actually, you know, boards, I think, need to understand the importance of human capital to your business. You can say it's the most important thing, but how does that really play out in your business? I think you need to have the strategy we talked about, where you are, where you want to go. You need to clarify the role of the board, ideally in advance of making big disclosures in this area. You know, how deeply does your board want to even be involved in human capital? There are some industries where your workforce is more important than it is in other industries. And so it's important in everyone, but it may vary. If you're coming through a merger, board's attention to workforce and culture needs to be a lot higher. If you're going through certain periods in your company's history, the board may need to be more deeply engaged than at other times. You also want to talk to your board about the multiple levers that they have. Traditionally, boards would view workforce, that's management's problem largely. But the board has multiple levers to drive human culture. So have a board assess that and determine which committee or committees are going to take control of this for you, oversee this for you. You also have to begin to work with your board on what kind of dashboards they want to receive. And finally, I think you want to assess the board's own capabilities when it comes to human capital management and oversight. You know, your CEOs inherently have some experience in this area, but you know, just like financial experience, just like legal experience, just like international or technological experience, human capital is a distinct area of professional expertise. So if you don't have someone on your board with that area of expertise, what are you going to do to actually get your board up to speed? So ideally, in advance of going out with your story to the rest of the world, you have at least done some of this spade work. One can only hope.
One can only hope.
And I don't know what your reaction is to that. I mean, does that seem about right to you?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, you talked about it at the beginning of this, when the slide came up, about having the right people in the boardroom. And, you know, that's what, you know, as investors, you know, we're not here to, we don't sit inside the boardroom. We're not there to run the company. You know, we're there to, you know, ensure that we have the right people sitting inside the boardroom that can oversee the long-term strategy, and that they're focused on the right aspects of, you know, that company's strategy. And so you're right. I think that, you know, some of this goes back to just ensuring that, you know, when you're looking at the composition of that board, that you're kind of casting the widest net possible, because like you said, in regards to the employees, what the company looks like today and what the company looks like 20 years from now may be very different. And so just making sure you have a line of sight on where you're trying to get to and that you're focused on the right things.
Right. It's a little bit like looking for your next CEO. It may or may not be the same profile as the one you have had, who was fabulous for the time and where the company was in the arc of its career, or its journey rather, but it may not necessarily be where you want to go next. So, well, Paul, I'm sensitive to the time, but I think there's a little bit more information that you wanted to share as well.
There's also a mechanical side to preparing for disclosure, so that's how you prepare your board. And if we could just pop up this other slide, won't spend much time on it, just make a couple observations. Okay, so what do you do when it comes to actual disclosure? It's obviously you look at what you're currently doing, you look at the law, the various reporting frameworks, what other people are doing in this area and have been doing. You read our new upcoming conference board report on the topic, obviously, and then you go to work in developing your human capital story. You figure out where you want to tell it. You determine and understand that this is probably going to be a story that you tell over time. The first time you go out with your SEC disclosures, maybe your updated proxy disclosures, it's not going to be exactly maybe even what you want, but understand that it's the start, and then you go through the normal process of your 10K disclosure. One thing to note is that sometimes companies have one committee that focuses on your 10K disclosure, your disclosure committee. You might have another internal management committee, that focuses on your proxies. So you've got to, and often your proxy disclosure involves people from human resources. You're going to actually need to get those human resources people involved in your 10K disclosure. So you need to look at who's involved in vetting your disclosures for the 10K, what your processes are in doing that. So you need to take a fresh look at your 10K disclosure processes and who's staffing that for you. So anyway, that's a little bit of the nuts and bolts mechanics of this.
No, that's great. And that sort of prompts this question. So part of the working group project that Paul and I have alluded to, we took a look at the various frameworks, right? And some of the disclosure guidelines are more qualitative in nature and some more quantitative in nature, and then some actually suggest both. I'd be curious to know how, and Aisha, perhaps I could ask you to start us off, how do you navigate through the various guidelines that have come from a variety of sources, not solely the SEC, but the World Economic Forum and a variety of others. And we went through them to try to get a sense of what things were in common. And there's about 10 of them or so that were almost in all the frameworks. But what advice would you have for a company who's trying to get their thoughts wrapped around this, and how do you navigate through that?
And I sympathize for all the issuers out there with the alphabet soup of frameworks and disclosures. I think that's why CalSTRS and other institutional investors, we really are trying to put our weight and support behind FASB. We like the process that they underwent in terms to try to find, those material risks for particular industries, because, I think human capital is kind of one that it does go across industries, but like Paul was mentioning, it can rise to different levels depending on the industry that you operate in. And so, while I realize there are so many out there, I also am encouraging companies, to really take a hard look at FASB, because we think that, it's a framework that is helpful and informative to investors, and it really does help us benchmark companies, because we need that consistency. Otherwise, the various disclosures really don't do us any good.
Paul, your thoughts on this before we go
I
to
think
the last
that
question?
when you're looking at the different reporting frameworks, whether it's SASB, GRI, World Economic Forum, and so forth, I think they are a very useful starting point in figuring out what issues you may want to consider as being important for your own human capital story. what's important. To make sure, if you look at those, you may be reminded that, oh yeah, as you mentioned, Aisha, the total cost of my workforce is something that's important. Productivity is important. Some of those things that might get lost in it. So it makes sure that you're covering all the topics that they mention. I think it also can give you, when you get a little more granular, some clues as to what specific metrics may be important. SASB is good, but there are others who mention some specific metrics. But I think the main thing is it's kind of like a starting point that you can use for figuring out what information your board needs and then your various external constituencies need in this area. It's not the be-all and end-all. The one thing where a lot of them, I would say, fall a bit short, and this comes out in our report, Rebecca, which is that a lot of them either say disclose the qualitative stuff or disclose the quantitative stuff. I think really effective disclosures require both the qualitative context and the quantitative data that you can measure, then you can be held accountable for, and so forth. So I think maybe be sure you're choosing from both columns, qualitative and quantitative, but use those reporting frameworks as a starting point, not as something you can try to satisfy. And I think if Bill were with us on this, he would also note that these frameworks are not static, that investor requirements and expectations and so forth will change here. So if you're always chasing after the latest bell or whistle on a reporting framework, you're going to lose sight of your main story.
I think that's right. You have to understand what works for you and not necessarily copy what some of the really terrific companies chosen to disclose in the way in which they've done it. It doesn't necessarily, it's difficult to wear the same jacket if everyone's different, right? So here's a question, and may I ask if we could start with you, Aisha. So what should investors and companies be doing now to prepare for constructive, engaging conversations on human capital, whether it's at the tail end of the off season or during the upcoming proxy season? What's your advice as to what they should be thinking about, or how should they be preparing for these conversations?
I think that, what we're doing with the Pandemic Resilient 50 is, wanting to have an open dialogue with companies because, we don't have the answers to all of this. I mean, I don't think anybody would have predicted that, 2020 would be a global pandemic and that, various aspects of our economy would be completely thrown off track. So I think just having an openness to a constructive dialogue and a willingness to engage with your investors is really critical. I try, we're not that scary as investors. We try to be, transparent and open about, what our agenda is and what we're asking for. And I think when it comes to the Pandemic Resilient 50 or even some of those off-cycle engagements, we're really just hoping that companies are receptive to our thoughts and our ideas in terms of what we're looking for. And I actually think that these off-cycle engagements are much more productive than the ones that come right before the proxy because, once we get to the proxy season, what's in the proxy is pretty much set in stone. What we like to do, and the reason we engage is because we think we have an opportunity to influence, better disclosures, better performance, risk mitigation. And so we like to do that in the off season when we think we can actually have an effect.
Yeah, and I'm picking up on that.
Sure.
I think off-season engagement this year may be more important than almost any other year because companies have an individualized story to tell that you may not know from looking at the surface of it. Again, like if you think about Quest, it's not here on this call. We can talk about them because they're not here maybe. But that they had an extraordinary story. Initially when the pandemic hit, their business was really hard hit because people weren't going to the doctor anymore for any of the regular tests. But then people started to use them for COVID tests, right? So a huge shift even during the course of the pandemic, and different parts of their business were affected differently. So this is an opportunity. It's kind of hard to, you want to make sure your individualized story gets out there to investors during this off season, because they're going to be using that as a backdrop for evaluating what you then need to disclose in somewhat more truncated form in your proxy when it comes to your exec compensation decisions and so forth. In terms of getting prepared for it, so I think it's more important than ever. In terms of getting prepared, there are the basics of know what your investor policies are, know what they're looking for, know your own story. But I think two things are particularly important this year in the area of human capital that haven't been important in the past. The first is really listening to your investors. If you think of these as opportunities to tell your story, this is really an opportunity to listen and hear what investors are hearing from other companies and hear what they are looking for and what they think would be helpful. The other thing is this is a time to tell a story about what's happening to your workforce overall, and have that candid discussion of how you're treating your workforce, because investors, we've heard this, Aisha, from all kinds of investors who are saying they're going to be evaluating companies next year when it comes to executive compensation and things, not just on how well the company did, the executives versus investors, but executives versus employees. So there is an opportunity here to listen more deeply in the past and tell the story about your workforce and what happened to your workforce overall and why in these off-season engagements.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think it will be very clear as we start to see more of this disclosure come to the fore, how people treated their employees throughout this process. You mentioned, whether or not sick leave pay would be granted, or whether or not additional compensation for those who are on the front lines, whether or not that's rescinded. But I think also people are going to start to look at what have you done for the health and well-being of workers, because I think that the next big bubble here is going to be the level of stress. It's one thing to get higher productivity during a short burst, if you will, but I don't think it's sustainable. And I'm very concerned about, companies, and they need to talk about how they are supporting employees, whether or not, they're trying to fix all of society's shortcomings. Here they are, they're in the workplace, and so what shall we do? So,
no, I was just going to say, I think
sorry, go ahead.
That's a lot of what we talk about when it came, I know I keep talking about the pandemic resilient 50, but these are companies that were, acutely affected by the pandemic, and so we're asking a lot of questions about the health and well-being of their workforce. The only other thing that I would add, and I think this is something that all companies need, it's not a metric. I mean, I think it can be incorporated into that metric I talked about in terms of the total cost of your workforce, but really around training and development, because, we've said this now repeatedly, maybe your company doesn't look like it does, today, 10, 15, 20 years with technological changes, societal changes. And so I think really understanding and having a robust training and development program for those employees is critical. And I think communicating that, again, can be a competitive advantage in terms of getting, retaining employees, your customer base, and your investors.
Absolutely. And now that talent, in many cases, can be sourced from a variety of remote places, and you're going to be having a very different battlefield when it comes to retaining or attracting and retaining top talent. I think it's vitally important that that companies think about how they communicate this. Paul and Aisha, perhaps I just ask if in these closing moments, any last quick word of advice for companies and investors when it comes to human capital disclosures. So may I ask you if you'd share?
That, everyone listening, or for the issuers that are on this panel, to really think about those 4 metrics that I talked about at the top of this hour. I think that they're really straightforward, fairly easily, to be implemented at a low cost, and it would just be, I think, extremely helpful for the rest of the investors. And it's not just CalSTRS, the Human Capital Management Coalition, those are the 4 metrics they're focused on, and that includes a wide group of global investors.
That does seem to be where the coalescence is, absolutely. Well, thank you. Paul,
The
anything
only
to
thing I'd
add?
add is be sure you set aside enough time with your senior management and your board, not just now, but on an ongoing basis to talk about human capital issues, about your workforce issues. Don't be scared of it, but if your workforce really is your most important asset, spend the time that's commensurate with it.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank you, Aisha, for being on the webcast with us today. This was tremendous, and I know Bill would have done a smash-up job had he been able to join us. So when Bill watches the recording here, we're still appreciative of all of his prep work on this as well. Paul, you were a tremendous stand-in. Not only could you moderate, but you can be, a content expert as you clearly are. So thank you both, and I want to thank everyone who had a chance to join us today. Paul and I and a team, we have a great lead writer, Solange Shiraz, who's on the call today with us, a variety of really smart people pulling together all the work that we've had in the working group. And that report, as you see on this slide, will be coming out before year end. Not only is it a report, which we believe is seminal in this particular area, but there's a tremendous toolkit of templates and examples and checklists and guidelines. So I think you'll find it very valuable as well. A couple of other things just to mention. There are two programs that you'll want to put on your calendar. One is the Governance Watch that comes from Paul's ESG Center. You'll see that that's the 15th, and it's all about the proxy season. And then it's followed the next day by the final Human Capital Watch of 2020, and it's about a human-centered and inclusive approach to wherever work happens. And we've certainly all kind of surfed through that process this year. But if you want to see those, please register. You'll see by clicking on the link at the bottom all of our various webcasts, and we hope that you'll find them valuable. We also have a series of podcasts that cover a wide range of topics, many of them human capital through a COVID lens and the support we think our companies could best benefit from. So with that, I'll leave you with this one last request. I'm responsible for a stellar webcast each and every time. And Paul and I look at these evaluations and we try to do something with them, and we'd love your feedback. Tell us what we did well, tell us what topics you'd like to see us attack, and tell us what we could do better. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you again, Aisha, for your time and your wisdom today. And thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure to partner with you. Thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thanks. Thanks, Lisa.